Hey everyone, Bearwire here for RunAtOnce.com. Today I've got the second part of my 1020 Zoom session with Makoma 1. If you haven't seen the first part, I definitely recommend checking it out just to get a little bit of a sense for how this player's thinking and kind of the aim of the strategy that we're working with so far. Picking up where we left off, we've still got this kind of unknown, I guess, wild card player, we're going to call him, on table 1. Not going to be raising those bottom end hands against limps, personally. I think that slightly more linear range in the big blind makes sense, and I think with the bottom of our range, we should tend to look to just see free equity, get the flop for free. This spot on table 2, I went for a small turn probe, which is a sizing that definitely benefits other parts of my range more than it benefits this king 4 here, but basically what I'm doing is I'm saying that I'm going to have two sizes here, and some of my kind of low-end strong hands are going to go in the smaller size, whereas like the higher-end strong hands are going to typically go into the larger size. When he flats and we get a pretty blank river, a lot of my true protection bets from the turn are not going to be interested in putting any more money in, or if they do, they're going to tend to bet small again. And I think that that would be underplaying my king at this stage in the hand. So once again, I don't know that I'm going to do two sizes here. In reality, this might just end up being my only size, the alternative being check. Because I think he's going to have a lot of like queens, jacks, tens, hands like 6x. So a lot of my protection bets won't love betting into that range, but if he's defending the turn properly, he's going to have a lot of unpaired hands here as well. So I think it's at least worth considering a river bet if I had like a6, queen 6. Otherwise, I think that for the higher end part of my range, I really need to put in a big bet because I think raises at this point in the hand are going to be very uncommon. 1.5 might even be on the small side for what I'm trying to accomplish there. Maybe 2x is a little bit more accurate. Some more limping from this player on table 1. And he's continuing to stab quite often with my ace high. I think that it's worth a single street peel because I'm going to be folding a lot of other stuff, and we've seen him show plenty of error for this line before. But when he scales up his bet sizing on the turn, I think I can play very tight against that. Jacks is not really a hand that I love to bet flop with. Even when I'm using small sizing, it's not fantastic. Works a lot better as a, well, really it just wants to be checking down for 1 to 2 streets. But when we face a turn lead, we definitely call. I think on the river we have one of the worst bluff catchers we're going to have here. On this run out, Makoma is representing like the pretty frequent 9x part of his range. He can have ace 9 and hands like jack 9, queen 9, king 9, but also like 9x of diamonds. Definitely 9-5 and maybe 9-6 or 9-7 occasionally. I can certainly have a lot of better hands than this, but primarily, like, when he misses this run out and wants to bluff here, he's going to have a lot of his jack 10 combos. Some hands like queen 10 as well are reasonably likely, or like missed queen x diamonds, jack x diamonds, hands of that nature. So having like a queen, jack, or 10 in my hand is pretty low quality. Having two of them makes this one of my worst hands here, so I doubt I gave it much thought. Seems like at this stage, some of the single entry players have left the game, so it's literally just 5 entries, 2 of myself and Makoma, and 1 of GA, whatever those numbers were. Pretty straightforward check call against the small bet, I think. Pretty much any 2 cards that are this big, like 2 cards 8 or higher, don't think I'm ever going to be able to fold flop. On turn, the queen improves a lot of the other weaker parts of my range, so I think like the king X that don't turn a draw are pretty obvious folds. Also like ace X. Some of ace X are probably going to want to call, but a lot of them are going to be in my folding range there on the turn. .207, those were the numbers. GA 207. Pretty straightforward pre-flop call, I think, for 7-9 of hearts. And I call flop, which is, for the most part, the only play I'm going to make. He uses a half pot sizing on the flop, which is not to be overlooked, given the fact that Makoma has started to introduce more bet sizes in general. At least in single raise pots, we've seen a handful of both big and small sizes. So it's worth extrapolating that information to 3-bet pots. Half pot or something around half pot is a very classic sizing for this board texture to see a polarized range that's attempting to put stacks in across 3 streets. Makoma definitely comes from that era of the game where that was extremely commonplace on a lot of textures, or maybe all textures, in 3-bet pots. So when he uses that sizing here rather than introducing some kind of new play, I think that I can make the conclusion that he's playing a pretty typical polarized range with, I don't know, a very small weight given to other types of hands like ace-9 suited or something. But when the 9 pairs on the turn, keeping in mind that his flop range was reasonably polarized, I think this is a great situation to take advantage of my range's kind of linear strength. So when I make a small stab here, I'm kind of making the claim that I'm going to stab here extremely wide, maybe my whole range or very close to my whole range. And what this does when you have like a strong linear range against a polarized range is it forces him to not only fold a lot of his equity, but it also handcuffs him into making a lot of kind of strong flat calls, because raising into my range, which is like throughout the entire range is stronger than his at the moment, raising into my range is going to split it's going to split the high-end part of his range away from the rest, and it's going to leave him extremely vulnerable to pretty relentless aggression on the river. He certainly doesn't want a situation, for example, where I can, bet 100% of my hands on the turn and then shove river for value with something as weak as maybe Queen-Jack when his range started polar. That would leave him getting bet into an extremely high frequency with an extremely weak range. So he has to check call the turn with hands that are as strong as like ace-queen or pocket kings, I would think. If not has to, then then I would say I'm extremely confident he's going to do that. So knowing that, I get to kind of play a more polarized river range myself, but in the meantime, my range benefited greatly on the turn by getting a lot of protection, forcing him to fold a lot of his overcard hands for the times when I have like 6-7 suited or something. So he ends up calling pretty quickly with king-queen. If you think about what I was describing in terms of his like flop strategy, we're potentially seeing like a light-ish call from him here. But that hinges on the assumption that he's playing the flop strategy that I'm claiming he's playing. It's worth thinking about like reflecting on your own strategy in these situations, because I mean, not that my play really changes at all. It's not super important what I have here, but I'm thinking from Makoma's point of view, because I'm sure a lot of you utilize a similar flop strategy to what I described that he was going to be using here. And when that's the case, you need to kind of treat your range here like it's a much tighter range than usual, right? It's almost better suited to a ring game player. And I think heads-up players might have a hard time acknowledging just how strong they might need to fold in certain parts of their range, or just how precise they're going to have to be in terms of distinguishing hands like King Queen and Ace Queen. So I think Ace Queen is a much better call than King Queen, just given what my bluffing range is going to look like against a big pre-flop 3-bet and then a polarized flop c-bet. And also, I mean, Queen Jack and King Queen, if he's playing polarized on the flop, they end up being some of the weaker hands that he gets to the river with. But that's making a fair bit of assumptions. It's just kind of the case that it's true for a lot of people. So if that sounds like the range that you're playing on flop and turn, I would take a pretty hard look at your river strategy just to make sure that you're not auto-calling every reasonably strong hand in your range on the river. Because I think from my point of view, that's also a spot where a lot of people would be a little bit gun-shy with their bluffs. Make a reasonable call with the Jack-10 offsuit. I think it's a little on the light side for the sizing, but it should work okay against most opponents. I think I can consider a flop bet, but checking just tends to be generally good. Checking is definitely the standard play. GA on the left-hand table, he chooses a half-pot turn probe, which I'm not thrilled about. I mean, folding a pair, like not a pocket pair, but a flopped pair, is a pretty big fold against just like a single turn probe. There's a lot of other hands that are lower on the totem pole as far as bluff catching goes and equity goes. So I don't end up making any drastic decisions. I wonder if I didn't think about calling river there. I'm not crazy about it. He's starting to introduce more sizes than simply the min bet, and I think he's starting to pick up on the fact that they're successful. Just don't want to let this showdown go unnoticed, but when fish start to kind of utilize a new, going back to the first part of, the first video in this series, I talked about how amateur players are a lot more concerned about poker strategy than they used to be. So you have to keep in mind how they like to adjust as well, and I think that it's a very simplistic thought process to continue to use plays that work. So if they seem to notice that bigger bets start to generate folds, then they can, within a very simplistic strategical mindset, they can decide that continuing to bet fairly big in general when they have nothing is a successful bluffing strategy. So I shouldn't continue to make the assumption without supporting, without kind of gathering new data, without supporting my claim. I shouldn't just continue to assume throughout a match that every single bet that deviates from min is a stronger bet or a value bet. Because if he notices that I'm folding at time after time after time, then he's extremely likely to deviate from his original sizing strategy. So this ace-10 hand, I already discussed the flop here. When I turn this much equity, I'm obviously going to call a 2/3 pop bet. I think Makoma's representing hands like King-10 here, Jack-9 suited, pocket nines, some frequency of like Queen-10 or nut flushes or Jack-high flushes. I do an okay job of removing all those hands. I have the Jack of clubs. I also have a 10. So that makes it a little more likely that he's bluffing with, I don't know for sure what his pre-flop range looks like, but I think he 3-bets at a pretty good clip. So it wouldn't shock me to see some like Queen X offsuit in his 3-bet range that end up turning a combo draw. It wouldn't shock me to see 7-8 of spades, check the flop, 7-5 of spades, check the flop, and these hands decide to start bluffing. I would say all in all, and I also, if he has like Jack 9 offsuit in his 3-bet range, I remove some turn 2 pairs. So the 9 pairing on the river, like I would have reasonably given thought to bluff catching this hand. Like if he decided to shove river, for example, I think I have a pretty strong candidate to catch bluffs. But he ends up showing down ace 10 with no clubs, which, to be honest, does not give me all that much information. That's a pretty reasonable line by him. Definitely not a hand that he wants to check call the turn with. And I think he's allowed to have some chunk of bluffing hands on that turn. I decided to check call the small c-bet from Makoma. And I will check raise some of my open-enders, some of my gut shots, but I like to randomize a bit so that they're not all check raising or all check calling. So I decided to check call with this open-ender, and we face 2x pot, which is just really unfortunate. In general, when I have a hand that has this much potential, we are very deep, which makes me interested in continuing open-enders in general, even though he's bet so large. But the thing is, I have the weekend of open-enders, so there are some mild considerations for reverse implied odds here when the 9 comes. I'm really just kind of, and also like spades and diamonds have kind of negative implications for me as well. So the upside is not quite as big as if I had 10-9 or 9-7, or if the board was rainbow. The upside's a lot bigger in all of those circumstances, but here there's 2 flush draws, there's 2 higher straight draws, and if the 9 comes on the river, I would say that a pretty high frequency of all the better straights are in his range here. Queen 10, not as much as 10-7. But for all those reasons and just like a poor immediate price that he's giving me, I do decide to fold that part of my range. But I think it's worth noting that I still tend to prioritize draws to the nuts over hands like, single pair bluff catchers when I'm picking my defense range. But I think he priced me out of draws similar to that one, unfortunately. Of course, we can also consider a turn check raise, which begs the question, what kind of bluffing hands am I looking for in a turn check raise? And I'm happy to open that discussion in the comments if anyone's interested. But I don't want to hang up on a single board texture for too long. Seven-six, pretty strong. Pretty strong hand on the turn here. Definitely going to delayed c-bet that the majority of the time, and there's a lot of rivers that I would be able to value bet, but I think that might be one of the few that I'm supposed to check. Meanwhile, I do see GA going back to a min bet, and this time he shows me a 9. Not a huge amount of information, but worth thinking about. Makoma throws a pretty interesting line at me, and I don't remember what I did here, but I know what I think I should do. So I think that I think he recognizes what my turn play implies. It represents a lot of value bets that are in this ballpark for like second, third pair plus draw, kind of hands. I've also checked behind the flop, which means that spades are underrepresented in my range. And I've also opened pre-flop, which means that deuce X is underrepresented compared to other cards. Now, I mean, I can make a lot of the same arguments about Makoma's range. He didn't lead the turn, which should discount a lot of flush draws. Didn't check raise the turn, which will discount some flush draws as well. 5x of spades, perhaps. A candidate for check raising the turn rather than check calling. And he called pre-flop, so I think deuce X is underrepresented. And then, of course, a variety of other strong hands, you know, straights or full houses, are discounted just by the turn line. So I think this can be just a play designed for how the population tends to treat these river situations. Aggression from me tends to be a little bit low, so I think that he has incentive to make this play for value the rare times that he does have one of those hands. If he has ace-deuce or deuce-3 suited or some kind of flush, I could see him anticipating a lot of checking from me and therefore deciding to lead out. And I do give some amount of credit for him following through the same train of thought when he has something like king 7, king 9, perhaps ace 3, those kind of weak turn check calls that were draws that are now just high cards. Because again, if I have a lot of protection bets on the turn that are now planning to shut down on the river, he's just going to see check check and lose the pot. So I think both parts of his range have incentive to bet there. I seem to have decided pretty quickly that the value portion of his range was the portion that had the most incentive, and therefore I should make a pretty strong fold. You could also argue, I suppose, or I could also argue, that having a 7x or a 4x here is a negative asset, negative blocker, and not having a spade is a problem as well. But I still think that I'm a little bit strong to be folding here. I'm surprised that I landed on that without a whole lot of intel there. Certainly a creative line, one that I think good players are using with both parts of the range. Relatively light call with the jack 5, probably my weakest offsuit hand. Maybe just overall, like right at the bottom of my offsuit defense range. I'm not going to do a whole lot of leading on this board texture on the turn. King X plus for value, good number of single card straight draws. Queen X and Jack X are pretty dense in my pre-flop range, so I'm going to be check calling a lot of those on the turn. And I mean, he did size small, so ace X will be represented as well, but weak pairs are not super common for me there. So when he overbets river, I think I'm fairly comfortable folding a very low jack. I think that falls outside of necessary defense. I think it's also important to keep in mind that king, queen, jack is a texture where he's more willing to check behind pretty strong hands on the flop. Something as good as like aces or ace king could very easily just check flop. And for that reason, he has more credible value hands to bet big on the river. With that dynamic, well, not dynamic, but with the situation that the amateur player is just with one table and myself and Makoma 2 tables each. I'm just going to go back to that hand quickly. But with GA sitting at one table and the two of us at 2 tables each, you might see us playing fairly quickly. I don't know if Makoma's thinking about this, but I think about this a lot. It's important that we keep the game moving somewhat swiftly to make sure that our friend doesn't sit out for 2-3 minutes straight because we're tanking on the other 2 tables and then just decide that, he's not interested in the game anymore. So certainly there's, at least I feel, some amount of responsibility to play quickly in those situations. If it seems like at some points I'm clicking through decisions a little bit faster than I normally would. If there's any loss in expectation for making a slightly errant decision, certainly going to gain it back by encouraging the pool to continue to run for a longer period of time. So I think I ended up checking the river with this king, and I could go either way on this. I think checking is very reasonable. I also think betting small is reasonable. But having one of my weakest kings in a spot where I'm going to have a variety of stronger hands, and a pretty wide variety of stronger hands, I think that there's definitely 2 or 3 different ranges that I need to be thinking about, and a weak king is kind of like marginal value here. So I could slot this into one of a couple different ranges. I think the check range and the small bet range are both very reasonable. Two overs to the 10. I think I could sometimes bet this queen jack. I don't block either suit, which might be playing into my decision. Rather just try to show down, maybe chop with queen jack or beat queen 9 or something. Pretty unlikely I win that hand, but I think it's an okay hand to bluff with sometimes on the turn. This king 6 here against GA, I take a pretty similar sizing line to what we saw against Makoma not long ago. I think it's pretty good actually against an amateur player because I think a larger turn bet when the just show the board one more time. I think if I had bet large on the turn here, it's just kind of it's a very visible card of strength for my perceived range. So I find it very successful against amateurs to bluff just like a big single bet on this king here. I think a lot of weak players would just go ahead and check fold some paired hands actually, because it seems so clear that I have something like ace king or king queen. So with that in mind, when I actually have a value hand, I think like a small protection bet, it's maybe a little more advantageous. I'll encourage some more lighter calls, and I'll put in money against, or I'll force my opponent to put in money with open-enders and flush draws, which are a real threat here. Because, again, for an amateur player, I think it's a lot more common to just check out a position multiple times, play passively with open-ended straight draws, even though they're low. Low flush draws, low open-ended straight draws, all that kind of stuff. Definitely way more common to play passive. So I do want to think about protection there. On this table here, we're over 200 big blinds effective. So I'm going for my kind of the large end of my 3-bet sizing. I face a 4-bet. Don't love folding away kind of a nice equity hand there, but I think he sized pretty well to force me to fold that hand. Slightly better suited connector and I'd be continuing, like 6-7 suited for sure, maybe 5-6 suited. I could certainly put in a small bet on the turn with 8-6, but I think it's also important that I just protect my check down range in a spot where it's pretty easy for villain to stab bluff the river. And I want to point out what he did here with pocket fours. It's actually, I would call that like a pretty good blocking bet, essentially. I'm going to have some weaker calling hands here. Hands like, I don't know, ace-king or 3x or pocket, maybe not pocket deuces, but 3x, ace-king, ace-queen. Those are hands that I'm extremely likely to call river with. And he might also believe that in the current state of the game, I'm a lot more likely to stab at some point with 8x or like pocket fives, pocket sixes. Maybe on the turn in particular, the way that I've been playing. So very reasonable when the 10 pairs for Makoma to think that, you know, his hand has shifted up into the potential block betting hand strength. And I just kind of like that with, I don't like it in every situation, but I think especially when your hand is a lower quality bluff catcher. So he removes a lot of my pure air, 4-5, 4-6, 4-deuce combos. So a lot of my pure air is less likely here. More likely I have 8x, 3x, ace-king, ace-queen kind of hands. Which means that by betting, he gets money in the pot against more of my like weaker calls that he beats, rather than checking and facing a range that's like bluffs that are discounted and value hands that are not discounted. And my value hands all beat pocket fours, but my bluff catchers, some of them will lose to pocket fours. So that's an important distinction to make. I don't know if he might not be thinking about it in the same way. It might just be a hand that he thinks is strong enough to bet the river, which is a little more simple. But I like the choice to lead out at some point with a hand like that, rather than putting it in the checking range where it's less successful. So there with the queen 8, I do decide to get a little protection. In king 5, this is a tough board texture, and I think one that I haven't successfully yet introduced like multiple bet sizes the same way that I've been describing them in other boards. Because when I check call the flop and then the queen comes on the river, a big chunk of my range here has a pair. Big variety of pairs, but almost all is paired. Or better, of course. So, but the problem is at the same time, hands as weak as king 5, I would say have maybe 60% equity here or something. That might even be low. Yeah, I mean, I could very easily have 75, 80% equity. So when he, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting spot. It's one that I'm definitely going to try and build a more robust strategy, I guess I'll call it, to be able to use multiple bet sizes and to kind of find the right bluffing range for those sizes. Because it's definitely a tricky situation. I would say it's one where I'm defaulting to a more simplified like big bet or check. And it's quite easy to make the cutoff there, where you know that like a medium ace or something is good a huge percentage of the time. And it's pretty easy to find the bottom X% of your range to match up with that. But when you start introducing the small flop bet from Makoma, that'll include some 9x, it'll include some king x, some weak pocket pairs. All of a sudden, you know, my king x has some value, my ace deuce has some value. So I think that introducing multiple sizes would be smart. And I would just have to figure out where I like to pick my bluffing hands for a small bet size in a situation where I have almost all pairs. So that's another one for the comments if anyone's interested. Getting through this footage a little bit faster than part 1. So I'll try and find a handful of more interesting spots before I wrap this part up. Don't want it to run too short for you all. That 9x backdoor flush draw might be a little closer than I'm giving him credit for. I mean, just have it, like, 2-card backdoor flush draws are pretty nice, even though it's 9 deuce, it's kind of hopeless otherwise, but I think that Makoma's bet sizing choices have left me seeing rivers for free a little bit more often than I normally would. So I think he's going like very small on the flop and then a lot of checking on the turn. A HUD would certainly help to assist me in that decision, but of course, more often he's checking turn after a very small flop bet, the more speculative floats I get to make. I think that one could have been considered. Folding the Jack 4, I did say that the Jack 5 was my weakest call, so I'm glad to see I wasn't totally wrong there. And I think that 10-5 suited is a very straightforward c-bet. So typically going to go for a turn check raise when I turn a set here, rather than leading out. I think a lot of his flopped hands are some of the most attractive, like, bet calling hands that he can have on a board texture like this. The deuce typically helps neither of us. So I think when I have a hand that's the effective nuts and I'm not actually blocking any of his, like, any of the stronger parts of his range, I think I improve my chances of getting a little bit of action from him by check raising the turn. Of course, if he was particularly passive in these delayed spots, I could just make really big overbets with this hand. It would serve kind of the same purpose. Left-hand table, I use a small c-bet on this monotone flop. I think because it's like ace-king deuce and there's that big gap in the board, it's still a pretty effective bet size. But I'm not always thrilled about using the small bet on monotone boards, because it's like, when villain flops a flush draw like 40% of the time or whatever it is, it's a little easy to defend to small c-bets, and that to some extent defeats the purpose of the strategy. So a lot of times I'll implement more checking and larger sizing. Not like big bet sizing, but just I'll implement a strategy that doesn't c-bet as often and scales up the bet sizing a little bit. Looks like I went for 3/4 on the turn, and close to full pot. Following up a small c-bet, I think this sizing is okay. It maps pretty well to like big aces and better, which is totally fine, I think. And I mean, seeing him not check raise the ace deuce doesn't really surprise me at all. It's a good strategy when the board is so dynamic to play passively with those like vulnerable but somewhat strong hands. Ace deuce is just like not super strong on this board, I guess, is the bottom line, because it doesn't have a draw to the flush. So I think it's very reasonable that he check called. Of course, I could maybe follow through with this hand. I don't remove any big clubs that he might be floating, but Jack high is kind of big in a general sense compared to other like showdown hands I'm going to have there. So I tend to give up the top end of my range. So I don't want to leave the last part of this video too short. So I think I'm going to wrap up as soon as these hands come to a close. King 10, I think, very straightforward. I certainly have the option to lead the turn, but I could also just go for check call or check raise instead. Check raise would be okay. Not my favorite play, but I wouldn't mind using kind of a stronger open-ender. especially when we have somewhat of a history of me going for turn check raises recently. It's a little more credible, I think. He might perceive me to put a lot more of my value hands into that range, and that might be why he played this hand a little bit weak. It's not 7-6 is not a mandatory bet at any point, but he might be a little more likely to bet the turn if he didn't think I was likely to check raise. So that's possibly an adjustment by him. And this hand against GA207, we face another min flop check raise. You could argue that I should stop betting some of the merged c-bets that I'm interested in betting, like in a vacuum, because I like betting this hand overall on flops, but when I'm playing someone who's kind of clicking back at me so often, it's possible that I should polarize my range a bit more. King 4 would make a perfectly good bluff catcher against all the frequent turn bets and river bets he's been making for small sizes. So I think it probably makes more sense for me to be playing these spots a little bit more passive on the flop, polarize my range a bit more, and just allow myself to deal with that turn and river aggression a little bit better. So I'm continuing to not be thrilled about my counter strategy to this guy. Certainly a lack of focus, it seems, fortunately. So I'm going to wrap up part 2 here. We got a little bit left. Yeah, I mean, I'll make sure that part 3 is plenty long. If we get through the footage too quickly, I can always go back and analyze like 1 or 2 of our favorite hands from this session. So let me know what you think in the comments. Go ahead and start the conversation about any of those hands that I mentioned if you're interested in a little bit deeper look at those spots. And hope you all enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Good luck.